From this point on, our brush list is not as cleanly segregated as the previous brushes. It's just a mix of various specialty / utility functions. And so it might seem a little bit random which brushes I cover here, but whatever brushes I skip over simply need more context that we'll cover in subsequent lessons. So the first one is the cloth brush. This is a big one. It might be the most fun you'll have sculpting and testing any of these brushes, but it might be a little bit underwhelming on this particular mesh because we need more geometry. So let's jump to object mode, hit Control 2 to add 2 levels of subdivision, and then apply that modifier. Right click, shade smooth so we don't get any of that faceting, and then also disable wireframe. Now when we jump back over to sculpt mode and use the cloth brush, oh my goodness, this thing is just crazy. So there's an actual cloth solver underneath the hood that dynamically works as a brush. And so in the brush menu, you have access to these solver settings. Personally, I find that out of the box, it works great. However, I will adjust the deformation types. We have several different options that change the core behavior of the brush. So drag is default, and it seems to kind of respect the underlying shape and lets you pull cloth over that underlying shape. If we switch that to grab, then we can yank this cloth around any direction that we want. And man, it is so fun. So take your time messing around with this, please. I'm not going to go over every single deformation type because you're smart and you can play around with these. Most of them are very intuitive. The snake hook is the only one that I can't seem to do much with. It seems very limited in a way that I don't quite understand. But if you know what I'm doing wrong, enlighten me in the comments. I will point to the enable collision option. So by default, these wrinkles won't collide with each other, though to be honest, I rarely run into intersection issues. But when we turn that on and go back to grab, the wrinkles should not do that, not intersect. I guess there is a limit, and so, be careful. But with that enabled, you should see less intersection and more collision behavior. And so that is the cloth brush in a nutshell. Again, take your time and experiment and have fun with that one. Next, we're going to be looking at our trim brushes. So this box trim is essentially like a Boolean, and it will delete portions of your sculpture. So we click box trim and draw a box out. It will, delete that chunk and fill in that space to keep the mesh solid, which is kind of weird because this mesh is not solid. We have that open boundary, but I guess if it's far enough away from the boundary, it will fill in. But if I draw that box at the top, it will leave it open and hollow. So, if we have a mesh that is not open, Alt Q over here, then it should always leave it solid whenever you box trim. And then these other options, if we click and hold the brush, like lasso trim, does the same kind of thing, but allows us to draw an organic shape to cut with. And keep in mind that this can take a little while depending on how much you're removing. It's basically a Boolean operation, and so those can take some calculation. Like that took a solid, 5 seconds or so. And then we've also got the line trim tool. And so as we draw a line out, there's a direction that has a darkened gradient, and that is the side that's going to be removed. And so that's really useful. Keep in mind that it will take a little bit of getting used to with how that line is drawn. So for example, I wanted to remove this right-hand side of the line, but the way I drew it, it's going to do the opposite. And so I can't really remedy that. I guess you can turn around 180 degrees and you just have to guess, if that's the proper plane that you want to cut away, or you can just undo it and then draw the line in the opposite direction. So, it takes a little bit of getting familiar with how that tool works, but certainly useful. And then we have the polyline trim, which allows us to draw out a polygonal custom shape and then click back where we started, and that will Boolean beautifully. Next in our list, we have line project, and this is extremely similar to the line trim, except it does seem to be faster, and it doesn't leave the color behind, right? These colors are face sets. We're going to go over that a little bit later. But the line project just seems to leave the colors as they are. and for whatever reason does seem to be faster. So basically identical behavior as the line trim. Next, let's go over the mesh filter, which is very powerful. Alt-Q to our other object. And essentially what the filter does is it takes a lot of these familiar behaviors that we see in other brushes and applies them universally to the mesh at the same rate. So let's take inflate, for example, and it will push all faces out according to their surface normal. There's also smooth, which clicking and dragging will gradually smooth out the shape. And so this can be useful, like, you know, the cloth here is very high frequency. And if I wanted to simplify that, say it's some kind of cartoony character, I can click and drag a little bit and then get a smoother version gradually till it's, you know, a simplified aesthetic, for example. But we can also do a relax operation, which if you remember slide relax, if we look at our wireframe, you know, it tries to keep the underlying shape while smoothing out the topology only. And this can be really useful, you know, as our meshes tend to get a little bit janky throughout the sculpting process. Let's turn off that wireframe. And are there any others? There's like the sharpen. Actually, this one's really cool. So if we look at the other side, let's say you're sculpting a character and you use the cloth brush, which ends up looking pretty realistic. If we use the sharpen filter, click and drag, it kind of tightens up the most prominent features in the sculpt, and you end up with this really interesting stylized type sculpting. So this to me looks like how cloth would be sculpted in the Arcane show, for example. And so this one's really neat to keep in the back of your mind, especially if you want to do stylized character sculpts. And I think that's all I'm going to cover in these filter types. I encourage you to play around with them and explore their settings, but being able to apply this universally to a sculpture definitely has its use cases. I'm going to undo the sharpen and then move on to the cloth filter. So same kind of idea, we're applying cloth to the entire sculpt at once. And so by default, if we click and drag, the thing just falls because the filter type is gravity. And so this makes a little more sense if we have a mask. And we'll go over masks in depth in a separate video, but just quickly, I'm going to mask out a portion of this sculpture, Control I to invert, and now that cloth filter will make it fall down just in that area. Alt M to clear the mask, and there's also inflate, which, I imagine if you're like doing a puffy pillow or something, that could be really useful. There's also pinch, which is interesting because it kind of sucks everything into the cursor. So these are very big, broad simulation type behaviors that no doubt have their purpose. Scale, what does this one do? Yeah, I don't really know what that one does, but you know, more options is generally better. And that's going to be it for the brushes in this video. Next, we'll take a look at masking.